And we're going to start with this quote. The greatest privilege in life, both in this world and for eternity, is to behold the glory of God. I'll say that again. The greatest privilege in life, both in this world and for eternity, is to behold the glory of Christ. I don't know if you believe that tonight, or whether you feel that even as a Christian tonight. Perhaps whether we like it or not, glory is inbuilt into all of us. Either it's the glory of God, or it's the glory of man, typically. In culture, glory is everywhere. Whether it's sport, whether it's celebrity, anything that we give praise to. But curiously, glory itself is often linked with war, battle. There's a board game. There's a board game called Victory and Glory. Victory and Glory, and that the board game is based upon the Napoleonic Wars. Clearly somebody thought that the two things went together. Victory and glory. Typically in our modern society, we often think that actually in war there is no glory. There are no winners. If there is no winner, there typically is no glory. If there is no victorious life to have after, if there's no perfection, if there's no standard of, wow, this is it, this is glory. Just imagine, but think back to Vietnam. America and her allies lost. Does anybody glory in that? Winning a sports trophy and not having an after party. A wedding without a wedding feast. Boris Johnson celebrating an election win without Mick Jagger and David Hasselhoff. But consider even this. Jesus' victory over sin and death without the new heavens and the new earth. Victory and glory go together. It's hugely tempting, isn't it, for life to look at our own victories and to look at our own glory. There are many battles to overcome in life. It could be the battle that we have in family. It could be the battle that we have with our class, our race, our gender. Maybe we've overcome addiction. Maybe we've won our battle to obtain asylum or citizenship in this country. But sometimes when we win these battles, it's all too easy for us to think, wow, we did it. We're the glorious ones. Just to give a biblical example, if you were to think back into the Old Testament and you were to think particularly at Daniel chapter 4, verse 30, and remember there was Nebuchadnezzar. His father had victory. He had won a decisive victory over the Assyrians. His name was Nabopolassar. But Nebuchadnezzar came to rule, and he had all the benefits of that victory. And he was able to provide a new society. He did all the architecture. He built the temples. He built the great palaces. You remember one of the 7 wonders of the world, the hanging gardens of Babylon, if they existed, was attributed to Nebuchadnezzar. But what does it say in Daniel chapter 4, verse 30? And this is so typical of us all. He said this, "Is this not great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty?" That's a description really of humanism triumphing over what would seemingly be God and his people. Remember that Babylon had conquered God's people. They had taken them captive. They had destroyed Jerusalem, the walls, the temple. The worship of God had gone. And man had set himself up as being the one who was in control. But when you look at the narrative, there were typically two things that were missing. In the way in which Nebuchadnezzar dealt with his people, one you might say was grace, and the other one was perhaps truth. Nebuchadnezzar dealt with his people in the most awful way. He set up an idol for everybody to worship, and anybody who would come to him that didn't come to the idol and worship the idol, they were done with. Where's the grace in that? And when you look at truth and you read the narrative, and you read the narrative of his servants that just simply went, "Oh, your majesty, long live the king, what can we do for you?" No one was really willing to tell him what his dreams meant, because one, they didn't know, and two, they were afraid of what he would do. No one would tell him the truth. What glory are we pursuing? What glory are we pursuing this evening? Is it our own, or is it God's? But here's the twist. The sad thing is that all human glory fades, whether it's Babylon, Persia, Greece, Romans, or even the British Empire. Our lives fade, our looks fade, our health fades. And our own human glory anyway typically turns into pride, and our pride turns into narcissism, the self-admiration, which pretty is ugly and pretty well is not glorious. But you know what? To not even pursue glory is also equally tragic. Imagine the life that sees no glory in anything. Is that not despair? Is that not depression? Life not to see the birds singing, to see the birth of a child, to see the dawn of the new day and not see the glory in it. Maybe there's some of us tonight who actually in our lives, and we say, I don't see the glory. Do we see any glory at all? So here's the question. What is his glory? What is Jesus' glory like? How is his better? His glory. In verse 18 it says that nobody has ever seen God, but people have seen the Son of God. He came to show us the glory of God. And this is where our verse comes in, verse 14. And it says this. We have seen his glory. This is what John says. The glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. We're going to just simply unpack this in two ways. We're going to look at his glory, and then we're going to look at his grace and his truth. So here's the first one. Do we see Jesus' glory? Do we see his glory tonight? Honestly, do we see it? Or are we kind of numb because we've just been watching the football or whatever it is? Or we spent a week or month just doing our own thing and looking after our own glory? What is it that John has seen that is so convincing? Remember that the whole purpose of John's gospel is so that we would believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And he's coming now, and he's saying, well, here's the glory of God. We've seen him. And that's meant to be somehow meant to convince us that they've seen him. But in what way has Jesus seen his glory? Was it Jesus' appearance? Was it his combed long hair? Was it his designer beard, his light skin, and, his halo? Our typical way of portraying Jesus. Remember Isaiah 53, verse 2? It said that of Jesus, he had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. So it can't have been anything to do with his looks, his glory. Basically, Jesus wasn't a looker. Maybe John is talking about the transfiguration. If you remember the transfiguration, where Jesus shows his divinity, the Shekinah glory comes from him. His disciples, the four, see him as he truly is, So maybe John is talking about that. But one of the interesting things is that actually in John's gospel, John doesn't ever mention, he's the one gospel that doesn't mention the transfiguration. And it might be odd that if John was really thinking of the transfiguration here, that he would be using it, because he doesn't then go on and give it any kind of prominence. But maybe he's thinking about that. Another area in which John might have seen his glory could well be in the miracles that Jesus did. On a number of occasions, glory and his miracles are put together. I'll just name one. Was his first one that John recalls, the wedding of Cana, where he turns the water into wine. This is what it says in John chapter 2, verse 11. What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory. So it could well be the glory of his miracles. And there is glory in that, clearly, it says from the passage. But one of the answers people say, well, if this is really to convince somebody, if it was really to do with the transfiguration or the miracles, then, well, I haven't seen it. I haven't seen this, John. How can I see this glory? Or maybe you could say, well, many people saw that glory and they still didn't believe. In John chapter 12, verse 37 to kind of 43, it says this: though Jesus had done so many signs before them, they still did not believe in him. And then in 43, this is what the description says of why. And it says, for they love the glory that comes from man more than the glory that comes from God. The answer perhaps is this, and some commentators put it this way, that what John sees is not really necessarily just a physical sight of Jesus, but it's a spiritual insight that every one of us that can have this evening. Just look back and think about Moses. I was quite excited when this morning we were talking about the Ten Commandments. I thought this would lead quite well into what we're doing this evening, because the passage itself actually links Moses and compares him to Jesus. That Moses came the law, but with Jesus came grace and truth. And you look at the glory that was revealed when Moses was on Sinai, and he was receiving the Ten Commandments the second time. And he asked to see God's glory, and God's glory was put before Moses, and God said, you cannot see my face, for man shall not see me and live. Exodus 33. And then God put Moses in the cleft of the rock, and he just allowed Moses just to get a little glimpse of his glory, just to see his back as God turned away from him. So Jesus saw the thunder and all the manifestations of his glory, of the light and the noise and the smoke. But along with that physical manifestation of his glory, there was also a much more spiritual. And along with it, this is what was said. This is Exodus 34, verse 6. The Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. What does that mean for us? That means that there's a character of God, and there's a glory in the character of God that we can all see, and see that as a spiritual reality this evening. We may know the stupidity of our own glory. We may see that actually when I start looking at my own glory, my marriage sucks, my friendship sucks, the way in which I operate in church really does suck when I look after my own glory. Maybe we've seen the glory and we've been in church and we see the glory of conversions. We've seen other people pretty much go from sex offender to saint. But there might be some of us here this evening that haven't actually seen the spiritual glory. We've seen perhaps the physical glory of the transformed life, but we've not really appreciated it, and we've been in church for such a long time. You see, what John saw is something that only Christians can see: grace and truth, and what that really means. Do we see the glory of God's character this evening? So, to move on, do you know Jesus' grace and truth? Do we know Jesus' grace and his truth? So why is it that John mentions grace and truth? Maybe he could have gone back into the Old Testament to Moses and talked about his mercy, his steadfast love, his patience, his faithfulness. Maybe he could have fast-forwarded to Revelation, and maybe he could look at the horse and Jesus coming again, and him riding on a horse who is faithful and true, bringing justice and putting everything right. The answer is that grace and truth is salvific. It's salvation. It's a spiritual warrior who's coming to win a spiritual kingdom in his first coming. One way I thought might be helpful to kind of understand this is that when you kind of look at, let's say, a normal warrior, a medieval knight, and if I was to say the word chivalry, and what would you think if I said the word chivalry? You might say, I think of a knight in shining armor. You might also think of a man perhaps giving up his seat on a train to a lady. They're quite opposite ends of the spectrum of chivalry. But in medieval times, in Christian medieval times, that was a very important characteristic for any kind of warrior. You would want that characteristic because the nature of a warrior is that when they go into battle, they are brutal, they are ruthless, they are bloody, they see smashed faces and broken limbs. And they exercise parts of the human character that are necessary and right, but you don't want that in civil life. It was said of Sir Lancelot, of King Arthur. He was considered the perfect knight. And it was said of him that he was the sternest knight to hold a spear. He was brutal, basically. He fought. But he was the meekest man to dine with the ladies. He was the meekest man. He had strength and meekness. That's a paradox. They don't kind of go together. You can't kind of be both at the same time. But yet, as a quality, you need both. A true champion is one who has the glory of the two intertwined in a way that we just struggle to do. Jesus was in a spiritual fight. He was fighting on the grounds of truth. But yet he was protecting his loved ones with grace. He was the fairest of the fair, but the toughest of the tough. In terms of grace, when you go forward in John's gospel, he heals a man blind from birth when everybody and the disciples are questioning whether or not it's really to do with his sin, and Jesus heals him. But then flip on, he's then in the temple standing up for truth, and he gets out a cord of whips and he drives people out of the temple to remove the falsehood and remove all the hypocrisy of the trade that was going on in the temple. There you have it, truth. He was full of grace, he was full of truth. In comparison, what are we like? And we struggle, don't we, in church, in home life? When do I say something? How do I say something? It's both grace and truth. And when should I do it? You know, even leaders of the church, it's difficult when you're counseling people. When do you just tell someone, that's it? That's the truth. And when do you go, and just hold back and be gracious? How much do we need this grace and this truth in Jesus Christ? So what about the truth? This is a major theme of John. There's a number of passages that really talk about truth. I'm just going to read a few of them. John 8, verse 32. And you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Whoever does what is true comes to the light. If you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples. You must worship in spirit and truth. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Now, in those verses, there's something just to note about truth itself. That in those verses, truth is directional. It's a way that points. It leads somewhere. Truth leads somewhere. Truth either leads to freedom, or it leads to light, or it leads to discipleship, or it leads to worship, or it leads to life. You can't have life, true life, without truth. In other words, truth is so important that according to these verses, we need to know it, we need to do it, and we need to abide in it. It's so vital for all of our living. But isn't truth a battleground? It always has been, always will be. Back in Genesis chapter 3, verse 1, what does Satan say? Did God actually say? Did God actually say? He was questioning the truth of what God said. Did God actually say, you shall not eat of every tree in the garden? The 16th century Reformation was all about the truth. The Enlightenment in the 18th century was an attack on truth. Today, the same battle lines are drawn. We now don't really know the truth about sexuality and gender. Our society's working it out. Our morality is relative. Well, that's your truth. This is my truth. It must be true. I read it on the internet. I mean, you can pretty much prove any truth just by Googling it. Oh, that fits with my view. Fake news. Can we trust social media or our lives? Do we despair? In John's Gospel, as we fast forward into towards Pilate and Jesus' trial, when they're trying to get to the bottom of the truth of what it is that Jesus Christ has done, and Pilate says to Jesus, "So you're a king, aren't you?" And Jesus responds, he says, "Look, for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth." And what was Pilate's reply? What is truth? Are you talking about Caiaphas' truth? The Sanhedrin's truth? Caesar's truth? Your truth? Whose truth should you believe in? What is truth? Jesus Christ came to give truth. And we see the truth clearly marked out by John in this first chapter. If you read verse 1 onwards, probably up until about verse 11. These are foundational truths that Jesus Christ came to show us. In the beginning was Jesus, the Word. He was God and he was with God. He made everything, verse 3. Jesus is life and he gives light. Verse 4, he gives clarity, he gives truth. But this is where the real truth hits hard. And in verse 11, he said, he came into the world and we rejected him. The glory of God had come into this world. We didn't want him and we rejected him for our own glory. Along with Pilate, along with the Sanhedrin, each one of us here this evening has rejected God. We sinned. We deserve death and eternal punishment. This is Jesus' truth. That really should hurt us. This is Jesus Christ, the spiritual warrior, coming to show us clearly that God exists and he is here and he's going to put things right. But to end on this, what about grace? What about grace? Jesus is full of truth, but he's also full of grace. Notice the emphasis here in the passage. He could have said in verse 16, out of his fullness we have all received truth upon truth. But he doesn't say that. He says we've received grace upon grace. That's not God giving us one massive lump of grace that we can just use up and exhaust. This is grace upon grace so that we are never, ever hungry for it. I mean, what is this grace? We can give some very simple dictionary or Bible definitions. In the Old Testament, it was steadfast love, really. It was the description of grace. In the New Testament, it much more talks about undeserved favor. That's just a description. But what really is it in this passage? What is the gift that's being given? And if you were to read verse 11, from 1 to 11, and talk about the truth that has come into the world, then in verse 12 and 13, you really get the grace of what God has given. It says this, but to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born, not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. The important word I want us to focus on here is the word born, or translation, beget. You know, beavers, right? They beget beavers, right? That's logical. Hamsters beget hamsters. Rats, guinea pigs. Jesus Christ was the only begotten. That God begat Jesus. Jesus was in the image of God. God had all the glory. Jesus too has the glory because he has been begot. And now he says, you can become children. God begat you. God begat me. And that means that we too can be like him. That's the grace, that he would give us all the glory of his nature to us. What grace when we've gone so far from him. So what is it that really, if you were to compare Moses and what John sees, you know, Moses sees God walking away. He sees the back of God and just sees some of the characteristics of God. But here we see, in this passage, that John saw him face to face. You know, if you used to see God walking away from you, yes, you would see his justice, his mercy, his wrath. You would see many characteristics. But when you see a God who is coming towards you, he's coming with grace and he's coming with truth. Later on, when John writes his letter in 1 John chapter 3, verse 2, he writes this. He says, we know that when Jesus appears, when he comes as a second coming, we shall be like him, he says. And why? Because we shall see him as he is. To see him is to be like him in his glory. Do you want the life? Do you want the glory? Do you want to rely on your own resources, or do we want to rely on the resources of God? Well, simply, if it was for this year, one of the greatest things that we can do in our lives is to just simply seek for the glory of God. If you're not a Christian, this is grace. This is a gift. This is not something that we can do on our own. God gives us this sight. We just simply ask him for it. Would you do that this evening? If we're a Christian and we're holding back, sometimes we can go dull and our vision goes dry and we can't see his glory. Would we lift our eyes once again? Just to go back to Nebuchadnezzar, remember God judged Nebuchadnezzar and he became like an animal. And Nebuchadnezzar, when he writes in Daniel chapter 4, verse 34, it says, at the end of that time of him being an animal, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes towards heaven. He looked back towards God. He looked to Jesus in our New Testament sense. And my sanity was restored. Then what did he do? He praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. So I'm going to repeat this again. The greatest privilege in life, both in this world and for eternity, is to behold the glory of Christ. And we pray God would bless that to us.